The first civilization produced the first medicine. About 6,000 years ago, the Sumerians migrated from Persia and settled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They invented cuneiform writing, they invented farming, and they discovered a plant that would cause more pleasure and more suffering than any plant in history. They called it Hull Gill, the plant of joy. Carl Linnaeus, a Swiss botanist, called it Papaver somniferum. And today we call it the opium poppy. The money is in the seed pod. The seed pod produces this milky white substance which hardens and turns a little grayer as it is oxidized by air, and it contains 5 ingredients. The principal ingredient is morphine, which is a powerful analgesic, codeine, which is methylmorphine, which is a mild analgesic and cough suppressant, alpha-narcotin and papaverine, which are muscle relaxants, and thebaine, which forms the basis of a drug that is now killing about 19,000 people a year in the United States. The first to really talk about opium was the father of modern medicine, Hippocrates, who in 400 BC used it to treat insomnia. A contemporary of his, though, Diagoras of Milos, really probably made the most important observation when he saw that many of his fellow Greeks had become hopelessly addicted to the drug. He became the first person in history to argue against its use, declaring that it was better to suffer pain than to become addicted to opium. His warnings have, for the most part, been ignored for the last 2,500 years. And so opium users became opium addicts. The first to really modify opium was Paracelsus, who was an alchemist in the 16th century who mixed opium with brandy, calling his concoction laudanum, from the Latin laudare, to be praised. Quote, "I possess a secret remedy that I call laudanum and that is superior to all other heroic remedies." Laudanum swept through Europe and eventually the United States. Louisa May Alcott, George Washington, and Mary Todd Lincoln were addicted to the drug. And it became something that was seen to some extent in culture. In Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, Mrs. Henry Lafayette Dubose is a laudanum addict, and she's treated, as frankly was true of people who use laudanum, sympathetically, even though she weighed 27 pounds at the time of her death. The next up to try and modify this opium, and again, the constant goal is to try and separate pain relief from addiction, was Frederick Sertner in 1803. He was a 20-year-old German chemist's apprentice who then isolated the principal component of opium, which was morphine. When he finished his studies, he was addicted to the drug. Quote, "I consider it my duty to attract attention to the terrible effects of this new substance I called morphium in order that calamity may be averted." But in 1827, the German pharmaceutical company Merck began mass-producing morphine. European and American doctors prescribed it for a variety of illnesses. Morphine was also a staple of the patent medicine craze. So, for example, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, the mother's friend, contained 3% morphine. And I'm sure it was the mother's friend. I mean, I'm sure children slept like logs through the night after getting morphine. Next up was Dr. Alexander Wood, who in 1853 invented the hypodermic needle. Wood reasoned that if morphine was injected instead of ingested, that people wouldn't develop an appetite for the drug, hoping again to separate its pain relieving from its addictive properties. He believed that he had done that. By 1880, almost every physician in the United States owned a hypodermic needle and began instructing patients on how to use it. Wood's wife would later die from a morphine overdose, the first recorded patient to die from an injected drug. By 1900, more than 300,000 morphine addicts lived in the United States. And so opium addicts had become morphine addicts. Now, with the fact that one was injecting drugs, this was much less, people who were addicted to morphine were treated much less sympathetically than those who were addicted to laudanum, as represented, for example, in the Otto Preminger film, The Man with the Golden Arms, starring Frank Sinatra as Frankie Machine, and the terms like junkie came out. Junkie meant that these people would, for example, go to junkyards to try and find things to sell to support their habit. Next up was C.R. Alder Wright, who in 1874, he was a pharmacist in London who diacetylated morphine. Convinced that he had finally created a non-addictive painkiller, he published his findings in the Journal of the Chemical Society of London, and nobody paid attention to this. 21 years passed. Until Felix Hoffman and Henrik Dresser in 1895 noticed that paper and thought that this could be of value. They worked for a nascent, small pharmaceutical company in Germany called Bayer Laboratories. Now, they had recently acetylated another chemical, sodium salicylate, which had been used as an anti-inflammatory drug to treat rheumatism. The problem with sodium salicylate was that it had caused gastritis. They felt that by acetylating it and making acetyl salicylic acid, that it would cause less gastritis, and it did. That was an advance, and they called their product Bayer aspirin. Now, in the same year that they acetylated sodium salicylic acid, they also diacetylated morphine, as had been taught to them by that previous paper. They fed their new drug to a few rats and rabbits that loved it. They fed it to 4 workmen in their company who also loved it. I think most of you know what's coming. They tested the drug on a handful of people for a few weeks, claiming it treated colds, sore throats, headaches, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. They presented their findings to the 70th Congress of German Naturalists and Physicians, where they received a standing ovation. Trying to decide what to call the drug, they initially wanted to call it Wunderlich because it had wonderful properties, but instead they called it a variant of what was Heroisch because it had heroic properties, and it was called Bayer heroin. Now, when it came into the United States, Bayer advertised both of these products together for the treatment of coughs and a variety of illnesses. Interestingly, aspirin was available by prescription only because the fear was that aspirin could also cause gastritis, which is true. I mean, much less so than sodium salicylic acid, but it still caused gastritis. Heroin, on the other hand, was available over the counter. It was not a prescription drug. It could be bought over the counter. In 1900, Eli Lilly began distributing heroin in the United States, promoting it side by side with aspirin as a treatment for colds and flu, claimed it was safe even for pregnant women. If you look in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1906, it states that heroin, quote, was recommended by the American Medical Association chiefly for bronchitis, pneumonia, consumption, which is tuberculosis, asthma, whooping cough, laryngitis, and hay fever. And so morphine addicts became heroin addicts. By 1910, doctors were fully aware of heroin's dangers, and professional use declined. By 1918, more than 200,000 heroin addicts lived in New York City alone. In 1924, Congress passed the Heroin Act, making the manufacture of heroin and sale of heroin illegal in the United States. And so it went underground. And when it went underground, it was then taken up by mobsters, who in the early 1900s had names like this: Arthur Flegenheimer, also known as Dutch Schultz, Jack Legs Diamond, Meyer Lansky, all of whom had one thing in common, which is that they were all Jewish gangsters. Because in the early 1900s, about 80% of organized crime in the United States was run by Jewish mobsters. And I come from that family. My grandfather's brother, Barney Offit, was one such person. If you want to read about him, his son wrote a book about him. His son's name was Sidney Offit, and he wrote a book called Memoir of the Bookie's Son. But this is true. Interestingly, the Yiddish word, and you're not going to find this in Leo Rostin's Joys of Yiddish book because it was a slang term, but the Yiddish term for addict was schmecker. And so the slang term that was used by these Jewish mobsters to describe heroin was schmeck, which then was anglicized to smack. That's where smack comes from. Eventually, the organized crime was taken over much more so by the Italians than the Jews, for example, people like Charles Lucky Luciano. And initially, heroin was confined to the urban poor, but by the 1940s, the use spread to the Harlem jazz scene. By the 1950s, through the writings of Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs, to the Beat Generation, and by the mid-1960s, more than 500,000 Americans were addicted to heroin. The U.S. government took action, trying to pressure Turkey to stop producing opium and try to eliminate the importation of heroin through France, otherwise known as the French Connection. Efforts were dramatized in the movie The French Connection, starring Gene Hackman as Popeye Doyle. Doyle is bad news, but a good cop. In 1971, President Richard Nixon, declared an all-out war on drugs. He said, "America has the largest number of heroin addicts of any nation in the world. If we cannot destroy the drug menace in America, it will surely destroy us." To help him in this effort, he picked, good, Elvis Presley, about whom this has also been a movie. It's actually came out this year, Elvis and Nixon, starring Kevin Spacey and Michael Shannon. Elvis was an unusual choice when he died in 1977. At the time of his death, Valium, methaqualone, morphine, codeine, and barbiturates were found in his bloodstream. So next up was thebaine. So in 1916, two German chemists chemically modified another component of opium, thebaine, to make oxycodone. Now, I should probably explain this. There's a difference between the term opiate and opioid. Opiate is something that is directly obtained from the opium seed pod. So morphine is an opiate. Codeine is an opiate. Thebaine is an opiate. If you chemically modify it, it's an opioid. So heroin is an opioid. And thebaine, when it was modified to oxycodone, then oxycodone becomes an opioid. In the early 1950s, oxycodone made its American debut as Combionox, which was oxycodone plus ibuprofen, and Percocet, which was oxycodone plus acetaminophen, Tylenol. The most powerful preparation of oxycodone, however, was uncut, and it was OxyContin. Made by Purdue Pharma. Initially, it was marketed as a first-line agent for arthritis. Purdue combined oxycodone with an acrylic to allow for a time release of the drug, but if you chewed the drug, you could actually bypass that time release mechanism and get an immediate hit of as much as 160 milligrams of oxycodone. I think the person who really gave us, in many ways, the current oxycodone epidemic or opioid epidemic was a well-meaning New York City pain specialist named Russell Portnoy. Portnoy, in 1986, published a paper in Pain, which was a study of 38 patients on opioid painkillers, only 2 of whom had become addicted, and both had had a history of addiction. He believed that with appropriate opioid use, that once again, we could separate pain relief from addiction. He chastised his colleagues for their opiophobia, and he argued that it was time to make pain the 5th vital sign, that no one should have to suffer. I don't know if any of you have been to an internist recently, but if you go in, one of the first questions you're always asked is, are you in pain? And so he was very influential. I mean, he wrote the chapters for textbooks. He was a very well-known speaker, and he sort of was an evangelist for this notion that we shouldn't be scared of opioids. It really, where this came from, initially it was Cicely Saunders, who in England, associated with the hospice movement, believed that people in their last few days of a terminal illness should not have to scream out in pain. And so that one should be able to use things like morphine and heroin in those patients, and that was fair. And that also then spread to the United States, where there were a number of states that had basically these compassionate use for opiate laws. And so it that opened the door for the use of more use of morphine and heroin, actually. But what Portnoy did is he crossed the line then from patients who were terminally ill and in pain to those who were in pain, period. And so heroin addicts became opioid addicts. In 2002, a survey at a Royal Michigan high school showed that 98% of students had heard of OxyContin and 9.5% had tried it. In 2003, Rush Limbaugh, who had mocked drug abusers for being morally bankrupt, admitted his addiction to OxyContin. In 2004, 3 million people were using OxyContin, the most prevalent prescription painkiller in the United States. In 2007, about 14,000 people in the United States died from prescription painkillers, costing the criminal justice system in the order of $55 billion. In 2008, about 15,000 people died from prescription painkillers, the leading cause of accidental deaths in 30 states. In 2009, health insurers spent $72 billion in direct health care costs related to painkillers. In 2010, more people died from prescription painkillers than from heroin and cocaine combined. In 2012, about 12 million Americans aged 12 years and older reported the recreational use of prescription painkillers. In 2014, retail pharmacies dispensed 245 million prescriptions for painkillers. About 2.5 million adults were addicted to the drug. This was enough in the way of prescriptions to really medicate pretty much every adult in the United States for about a month. In 2015, 19,000 people died from prescription painkillers. More young people died from opioid overdose than from motor vehicle accidents. The United States, which represents about 5% of the world's population, uses 80% of the world's painkillers, even though I would argue that we don't really experience 80% of the world's pain. And so I will conclude well in time with this notion: the medical profession's undying belief that it can effectively separate pain relief from addiction has remained a lesson unlearned. Thank you.